Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us, especially those of you here during your reunion weekends. For those of you I haven't met, I'm Lauren Noble, and I'm the founder and executive director of the Buckley Program. Launched in 2011, the Buckley Program is devoted to bringing much-needed intellectual diversity to Yale's campus and keeping the legacy of William F. Buckley, Jr. alive. Throughout the year, we host a speaker series, conferences, seminars, and much more. We have a vibrant Student Fellows program, which last year grew to a record level of 283 students. As you can imagine, with the recent attacks on free expression on college campuses nationwide, the Buckley program has played an increasingly vital role on Yale's campus. Today, we're delighted to have an excellent panel of 2 alumni and 3 students to discuss the state of free speech and overall intellectual climate on Yale's campus. I'm going to turn it over to our wonderful moderator in a moment. Before I do, let me note that this event is being recorded, and we will be taking questions at the end, and when we do, I'll be the one walking around with the mic, so you can just make eye contact with me. Also, at your tables, you'll notice copies of a recent survey we did of Yale attitudes towards free speech and intellectual diversity issues on campus, so I encourage you to check that out. And we also, over on that table over there, we have copies of the second Buckley Program book, Campus Speech in Crisis, What the Yale Experience Can Teach America, as well as some more copies of the survey and also a memo from our friends at the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, highlighting some of the issues with Yale's speech policies. So please feel free to take copies of those, take more than one, and share with fellow alumni. Now to introduce our moderator. Jean Daddle of the Yale class of 1966 is a historian and an author of the forthcoming book, Reckoning with Race, America's Greatest Failure. After Yale, Jean received his JD at Vanderbilt Law School, an international capital markets investment banker for 2 decades. He's also the author of 2 other books, The Sun That Never Rose, as well as Cotton and Race in the Making of America. Jean and his lovely wife are wonderful supporters of the Buckley program, taking a real interest in our student fellows and providing very important encouragement to them. So please join me in welcoming Jean. And I'll turn it over to him in a moment, but just before I do, I want to introduce the rest of our panel. Nathaniel Zelensky is a member of the Yale Law School class of 2018. He majored in history at Yale and upon graduation was awarded a Paul Mellon Fellowship to attend Clare College, the University of Cambridge, for 2 years. He holds an MPhil from Cambridge, where he studied history and international relations. His writings have appeared in a variety of outlets, among them Commentary, Foreign Affairs, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, and National Review Online. He is also the editor of the Campus Speech in Crisis book that I mentioned. Next to Nathaniel, we have Maddie Fortier, who is a junior majoring in ethics, politics, and economics. Last summer, Maddie worked as an editorial intern at the New Criterion magazine in New York City. This summer, she's interning at the Manhattan Institute, and both of those internships have been coordinated through the Buckley program. She's also the speakers director for the Buckley program. Next to her, we have Noah DePonte Smith, who is a senior double majoring in history and political science. In addition to serving as the student vice president of the Buckley program, Noah has been a serial Buckley program intern for the past 3 summers, interning at Forbes Opinion, National Review, and again, National Review. So he's competing with Maddie for the most number of Buckley internships. And finally, we have Cameron Kaufman, who is a junior majoring in ethics, politics, and economics. This past year, he called Yale baseball and football games for the WYBC, while also doing a weekly sports talk show and weekly political talk show. He's also the membership director for the Buckley program, and this summer, he's interning for CNBC. And that is your panel. I'll turn it over to Jean.
Thanks. Welcome to this panel, and this is a discussion, so feel free to interject with comments or questions. My introduction to the William F. Buckley Society Jr. was through William F. Buckley's Firing Line, and I was a major fan. and really quite enjoyed this open discussion of ideas. Here was a guy who could sit down for an hour with people as different as James Baldwin and George Wallace, and I found that incredibly intriguing. In terms of the Buckley Society, I was invited to a couple of large events, met Lauren, whose vision you're witnessing today. She planned it and created it. Without her, there would be no Buckley Society at Yale. Then, after meeting a lot of the students who we found interesting, articulate, engaged, knowledgeable, and spirited, we decided to further our participation in the Buckley Society, and we hosted a couple conversation dinners. And after that, there was a larger group that we met with. So our involvement with the Buckley Society increases, as well as our enthusiasm. In terms of the first question that I'd like to ask the panel was, what surprises greeted you when you came to Yale as a freshman in terms of the negative or positive discussion of ideas? And secondly, what was your introduction to the Buckley Society? And thirdly, what attracted you to the Buckley Society? Nathaniel, since you're the elder statesman here, why don't you start?
I actually, Gene, I may not be a good person because I was sort of in the ground floor with Lauren. So I think it might be better to, if you want to give folks a sense of the program, to move to some of the newer students.
Oh, Cameron. Yeah. So I came from a private school in New York City that had a similar kind of free speech crisis to Yale, Riverdale it's called. And, you know, it didn't surprise me coming to Yale that you had this same type of, you know, liberal faculty, liberal student body that was trying to shut out all ideas. But immediately I heard about the Buckley program through joining a YPU party, the Conservative Party, and a lot of overlap between the membership there. And I heard that it was a place, a sanctuary, where you could actually discuss ideas, where you could have real debate, something that I never got to have in high school. And immediately after meeting the leadership of the program, I met Zach, and I'm a Bengals fan. Zach's from Cincinnati. We hit that off, and I mean, from there, I just hit the ground running. And the Buckley program, it's really incredible because it's attracted almost 300 members from across the political spectrum on campus who are all committed to the same goal of debating, of discussing, and of seeing ideas. And there are many people on campus who don't accept that goal, so it's nice that you have this group that is committed with you. And the Buckley program has been incredible so far for me in having these great speakers and having these great debates. And through firing lines, as Gene mentioned, we've actually had productive debates about minimum wage was one that I really remember, where we had someone from the Center for American Progress debating an AEI fellow. And that's good. That's what we need on these college campuses, people listening to both sides, and that's what the program brings.
I think also the unique thing about when Cameron and I arrived on campus, so we arrived, so we were rising juniors, and so when we were freshmen, that fall was the big Halloween incident, and I think that really kind of brought a lot of free speech issue concerns to light that kind of really drove us to the Buckley program as needing a space where we could feel free to exchange ideas, and knew that a sort of principle of free speech was kind of undergirding basically everyone that we were talking to, when the entirety of campus was very, very politically polarizing.
Yeah, when I first came on campus, it was a year before Cameron and Maddie, but even then I found two things surprising to me. One was sort of the high level of intolerance of sort of the liberal consensus, and the other was that there was actually quite a strong and flourishing community on the right, both sort of the parties of the YPU and the Buckley program. So in the fall of my freshman year, I joined the Buckley program. Probably was not as participatory a fellow as I should have been in that time. But then after the Halloween incident and sort of the galvanization of campus politics that occurred then, I began to get more involved, started going to events and things like that. And I found that, yeah, this really was a community where you could have a political discussion, well, not even a debate, just a discussion with people of all sorts of viewpoints, because they all agreed on sort of the constitutive principle of free expression, without which there can't really be a debate. I had found in my first year that the lack of belief in that expression had stultified most of my discussions. So since then, it's been a great honor to serve as a vice president, to interact with lots of students, professors, people from outside, and to really see that this is a place where ideas get discussed and we have productive conversations with each other.
One of the things that I'd like to mention in terms of the composition of the membership as well as the people who attend the events is there are self-identified conservatives. There are people who have conservative views on some issues. But the bottom line really is the discussion of ideas. And you even have some self-identified liberals who participate in the activities as well. Most of you are probably familiar with the drama on campus, the Halloween instances, in terms of the Christakises and the recent one in terms of Dean Chu or the renaming issue. What interests me particularly is the day-to-day life of these students on campus in terms of the classroom and their social interactions, whether it's in the residential colleges, at meals, or otherwise. So I'd like them to comment particularly on the classroom. And one of the items that keeps coming up in our conversations is at times the distinction between dealing with a professor and a teaching assistant. So I think if you want to weigh in on that, I think all of you have views.
Sure, I'll weigh in. I mean, I can't really speak to Yale College, and I don't think it would be helpful to speak to the law school, which I think is a very warm and intellectually vibrant community. What I will say is one of the things I think is interesting is in the past 8 years, there have been a couple of things that have changed in Yale College that I don't know why they've changed, but aren't even necessarily related to ideological things, but have changed in ways that probably modify sort of the day-to-day environment. I'll give you just a simple one. When I went to Yale College, most people lived on the campus. They lived in a residential college, and it was important because it created a sense that where you lived, where you ate, where you worked, were all part of the same community. Today, about 50% of juniors and seniors are moving off campus. That's an incredible number. I mean, that's a magnitude of difference. And so I've been sort of thinking, why is that the case? I'm interested in the history of higher education. I thought I was going to be a historian before I went to law school. And so this is something that baffles me. And I think one of the answers is that at the root of why folks are moving off campus and at the root of why there's a little bit of crisis in the community on a variety of issues, whether it's the Halloween incident, whether it's something that has no political valence at all, is that there is a disbelief in institutions that is across American society. It's not just at Yale, and it's not just on college campuses. It's everywhere. You know, we know that institutions from banks to churches are less respected. And so I think that what you're seeing in small part is that students are less willing to buy into the idea that they are members of a community that they respect. So that's why they're not living on, campus in residential colleges. Those are manufactured communities.
The mic. So. Oh, great.
What about other factors like relative cost, availability of privacy, and the new colleges that are being built?
So if anything, I think that all of that would run toward folks living on campus. So, in terms of, I live in an apartment in New Haven. I don't like dealing with a private landlord. I can't imagine that any students want to deal with, setting up their utilities and their internet and, the comparable quality of housing for the same amount of money is going to be much better on the university's campus. I mean, each of those colleges is almost $500 million project or a $250 million project. I mean, they've all been renovated. They have gyms. I mean, from just a resource perspective, you'd want to be there. Privacy is an interesting thing. I'm sure the students can speak to it. When I was a student, I don't ever think that I had concerns for my own space and privacy. So I think that it's got to be something else because you're seeing in 3 years, you've seen a tenfold increase in the number of folks who are moving off campus. That's not just sort of my estimation. That's in fact what the Yale College Dean's Office has put out. And so I wonder why in a rapid period of time that's emerged. These other things, cost, privacy. Those would otherwise be relatively constant. And so I think, personally, I think that there was a lot of upheaval in the summer of 2014. That's when you start to see the beginning at Yale of some of these issues. And I think that's when you start seeing students come into the college who are very jaded. And then by the time they're juniors, they're starting to move off campus. So that's what I think was happening and is happening.
I should say I actually live off campus, and I do it because it's about $4,000 cheaper to live off campus. But I think what Nate's saying is relevant to the decline of sort of a public sphere at Yale more generally. There's been a huge decrease in the number of students who participate in intramural competitions. Berkeley won the Ting Cup recently, but I'm in Berkeley, but it sort of wasn't all that important. There seems to have been a decline in sort of the vibrancy of the political union, in sort of the institutions that once held campus together. These extracurriculars are starting to sort of fall apart a bit. They're starting to become more diffuse. People are committing to more and more things and ending up not doing much in any of them. There are various reasons for that, I think. Possibly it could be that sort of extracurriculars are more and more important to one's resume. So you want to get as many leadership positions as possible, but you end up sort of not having many substantive things to those leadership positions. But I think this is a very real trend, which is that the common institutions and public sphere that once undergirded the way that Yalees talk to each other are falling apart. And as that happens, it becomes harder and harder for us to have common links that we can predicate our discussions on. So if you want to solve the free speech crisis on campus, I think you have to look at sort of the not quite formal institutions which have become so hollowed out in recent years.
What is going on in the classroom in terms of your experience here?
In the classroom, many people will say that professors are a big problem. Some of them are. I don't think they're a huge problem. I don't take many classes with TAs. I take mostly seminars, so I can't speak to that. I think the biggest problem, though, is the students. It's hard to be in a class where there are 15 sort of proto-Trotskyites and one conservative, and to try to say, for instance, that maybe Brexit wasn't all bad. That's just really hard to do, and I've been in multiple classes like that, especially last year. The students seem to be unwilling to they'll tolerate other opinions, but they're unwilling to create an atmosphere conducive to the expression of other opinions. There's only so much that the professor can do to create that. At some point, it's 15 against 1. So I think you have to change what the students and how they approach free expression. The professors and TAs, yes, as well, but the most important thing is whether the participants in the discussion believe in the principle of free expression, without which you can't have the discussion. So I think we have to look at the students, and as far as that goes, that's a tough task, but I think we're doing it reasonably well right now.
So would you characterize the environment in the classroom as uncomfortable or hostile?
Probably both. Certainly, sometimes hostile, mostly just very uncomfortable. As the topic gets more sensitive, it approaches outright hostility, though.
I think putting an emphasis on the students, that's not to say that there aren't steps that the university could take to sort of cultivate an environment that's conducive to people holding free speech as a virtue. I think the University of Chicago put out an explicit letter to its students before they arrived on campus, saying that we are a free speech, non-coddling university, and these are things that we value, and if you're coming here, this is what you can expect. And I think that's something that really sets the standard that would definitely be helpful for the sort of seminar situations in which it can seem like it's really 15 students on one professor trying to have a productive academic discussion, but also sort of maintain standards of conduct and even sometimes just cordiality that make everyone feel like they can participate.
Any specific examples in terms of particular classes? Any of you?
Yeah, I have quite a few examples, but one that I do want to focus on is I'll start with a positive example, which is nice. We can be happy about one thing in free speech. And this past semester, for the first time, Yale ran this seminar, The Long History of American Conservatism. And it was about 18 kids in the seminar. maybe 7 conservatives, 7 liberals, and 4 moderates. So the most intellectually diverse class I've ever taken at Yale, and a place where there was free-flowing debate. And we discussed some pretty controversial ideas. We went all the way from 1780 to now, reading conservative thinkers, and there were liberals who were willing to engage on the debate, on the discussion, and our professor did a wonderful job of making sure that any idea could be endorsed, could be discussed, without anyone feeling uncomfortable, and hostility was kept to a complete minimum. And when you have people who are interested in learning about the other side, liberals who want to learn about conservatism, want to have discussions about it, that was a very productive forum. And I think that class, it had 40 people were interested during shopping period, only 18 were accepted. I think after the ratings it will get on course evaluations, it will be even more popular next year. And I'm very excited that the professor decided to run this class. It's not an easy thing to do, and there's a lot of pressure that comes from both sides when you run a class on conservatism. You're afraid that you could be criticized by conservatives as not being friendly enough on the ideas, and you could be afraid that the liberals will criticize you as being a conservative apologist. And I think he did a great job of towing that line. Now, Noah mentioned that he thought that students were a big part of the problem, and I would agree with that. But as someone who does take more classes with discussion sections, I've had a lot of issues with TFs, especially a political science course I took during the semester of the election, and there were probably about 4 Trump supporters out of 13 kids in this section, and the TF walks in on the Wednesday, this is the day after the election, and basically, is furious. I bet none of you voted for Trump. This is just, the worst thing that's ever happened to this country, and it became like a kumbaya fest in the section, and it was just, I felt very uncomfortable. I was making eye contact with these people. It just didn't even feel like a discussion could be had. And he didn't seem like he was remotely trained in dealing with ideas, which I think something that the Yale administration could work on. The Center for Teacher and Learning could at least tell them how you could have a productive post-election day discussion. Because I was in another political science class, and our professor, it was a lecture. It was about 30 kids, so it was quite small. We called up a Trump supporter from Nevada that he was friends with on the phone the day after the election. And that was, to kind of learn about what he was thinking, to have a much more productive discussion than to come in and, decry half the country as deplorables, as our TF did, and just go on a rant.
Just by way of relating perhaps your experience to mine, in the class of 66, I took a course under Stoughton Lynn, and I guess the only people possible who could have done that here were class of 67. And Stoughton Lynn was the epitome of the radical professor in America. And he was a pacifist. He went to Hanoi with Jane Fonda and Tom Hayden. He was a Marxist. I ended up on Wall Street, but it was really my first connection with the impact and the importance of economic forces. And in addition to that, he led the education part of the Mississippi Freedom Summer, and I'm from the Mississippi Delta, so he took a special interest in me. He never, ever brought his political agenda into the classroom, and we remained close during that class period. And I spent the day with Stoughton. Mr. Lynn became Stoughton, and his wife a few years ago in their home outside of Youngstown, Ohio, and I did an interview with him for my forthcoming book. But that was my experience. People like Stoughton Lynn, people like Robin Winks, who many of you probably knew, were very transformative in terms of my educational experience here. Another question is, in terms of Yale versus the rest of the universities, and all of you have friends at other places, do you think from the communication with your friends that Yale is any different than other places, whether they be liberal arts environments, Ivy League schools, big state universities, or whatever?
Can I just jump in, Gene, real quick?
Sure.
I think those professors are, it's not all doom and gloom. Those professors are still here. I mean, I think that's an important thing to recognize. I took classes with John Gaddis. I deeply admire and love John Gaddis. He has the Pulitzer Prize. He's a Cold War historian. He wrote a biography of George Kennan that is amazing. Folks like John Gaddis, folks like Paul Kennedy, folks like Stephen Smith in the political science department who teaches sort of from a neo-Straussian lens, I think there are a lot of folks who are, regardless of their political valence, wonderful professors. They're still here. So, I mean, maybe that's just sort of the distance of a couple of years and my relationship with those people, but I think that there is, look, there are wings of the faculty you don't go into. But that's in any faculty. You don't see me taking a class with Shayla Ben-Habib. She's a Marxist, self-affirmed. I mean, this is what she writes about. And I would not take a class with Shayla Ben-Habib if you paid me. But I would take many classes with many of her colleagues in the political science department, and I would happily teach as a TA for them. So,
What about friends in other schools?
Most of my friends either go to Yale or Chicago, and I think Yale is not so much weird as Chicago is, because Chicago has the conservative heritage and also had the letter by the president in August of last year saying that this is not a university that tolerates safe spaces. I think the Chicago model is a very good one to do. I wish Peter Saliva would have sent out a similar letter. I think the letter at Chicago was sent out with the intention of sort of forcing the hand of Harvard, Yale, and Princeton and all those other schools. But from what I understand at Chicago, first off, there's a lower level of political engagement than at Yale. At Yale, it seems like we're sort of always hyper-politicized. Maybe that's because Yale has a tradition of going into politics, of public service, and things like that. But at Chicago, because it's somewhat lower tension, there is more of a camaraderie and ability to have sort of free discussions on political topics with your friends, sort of just in the dorm. Partly that comes from the top, partly it doesn't. It's a question of where the balance lies, and I just wish Yale would go a bit more towards that balance.
I think that's a good observation, though, that the more political, the more that students are, interested in politics, the more extreme their beliefs can be. I think we've seen that on campus. I think the most vocal group of people on campus would be the leftists, the Bernie Sanders supporters. And those people, I don't know if they necessarily characterize most students in general. I would say most students on Yale's campus are liberals. But I would say that the majority of them are probably Clinton supporters. I think the people that we hear from are the Sandersites and the leftists. And I think that maybe having a more political atmosphere at Yale, having a great political science department kind of pushes people, the people who are interested in politics, they speak more and we hear more from them, which can make campus political climate seem skewed in a way. And it kind of leaves maybe a silent majority.
Cameron?
Yeah, so my best friend goes to Middlebury, and I can always look at him and be like, well, at least I go to Yale over Middlebury. And I don't have to deal with the Charles Murray protesters, so that's always a positive. But I will say that I think that at least at Yale, since the campus is so politicized, there is a propensity to bring political guests. And that means that the Buckley program does have political speakers once a week, once every couple weeks. Whereas at Middlebury, the Charles Murray thing, that's like a big political speaker comes once every couple months, and it's a very politicized campus. So you can imagine that these leftists are then going to make a huge deal out of it when once or twice a semester a conservative comes. Considering we have the Buckley program and we have the YPU and we have other campus forums, there are so many political speakers that come from both the left and the right that it would be fruitless, actually, for the campus leftists to try and protest and make a big deal and threaten every single one because there are so many. And while the campus politicization does mean that people are up in arms about everything and we have our silent majority that is terrorized by the Sanders supporters, it does mean that we have a great amount of people coming to the campus and ideas are coming to campus more than they're coming to places like Middlebury, which does give us more of a chance to discuss and more of a chance to hear perspectives that you wouldn't get to hear. My friend at Middlebury is miserable about the political climate there, and there's really nothing he can do about it because there's no one coming to speak, and when they do come to speak, it's the Charles Murray incident.
One of the things I think is interesting is that there is a cross-pollination that occurs from campus to campus to campus. And so you saw this when I was an undergraduate. There was a group that filed a Title IX complaint against Yale. It was a group of Yale students, and they were supported by a law firm actually based out in London. That was the first of a series of suits that were then, or complaints with the Department of Education that were then filed over the past, I think now 6 years or 5 years. But what you saw was sort of one campus developed a model. Groups then spun that model out and brought it to other campuses. And I think you see that with some of the protests that occurred around the Halloween email incident. One of the things that I was looking at a little bit from afar, because I was sitting in the law school, was the degree to which other campuses were picking it up. You had solidarity rallies, at certain campuses to be in solidarity with other campuses. So you saw this sense that they were trying to import issues from campus to campus to campus.
Let's pick up on one of the things that Cameron mentioned, which was the programs, and I think that the Buckley program has really been at the forefront of bringing these other speakers. So if you could all comment on, in terms of the programs, either from the speakers or the firing line or the seminars. And the seminars are particularly interesting, and Lauren started those this year, and they occur during fall and spring break, and they're non-credit. So you're having students, and these seminars are oversubscribed and non-credit, and you're getting non-Buckley students apply for them. So it's an extraordinary phenomenon. So let's get into the program aspect and what you find interesting about it, and not necessarily, you can talk about your favorite programs, but give us your opinion of the whole program schedule that Buckley brings to the Yale campus.
So I've actually participated in 3 of the seminars that you're referring to. The first was on the intellectual foundations of modern conservatism. The second one I did was on the Federalist Papers, and the third was on the ethics of capitalism. And I think that these seminars are really very helpful in filling possible gaps in a Yale education. So the first one I did, which was on the intellectual foundations of modern conservatism, was the first time I had experienced reading very academic, explicitly conservative texts. And I do think that the way that the seminar was conducted helped me, kind of delve into first principles and more of the philosophical underpinnings behind what I believe on a more political sphere. And so I think it's also key that non-Buckley students are applying to these seminars, because I think having liberals in the classroom kind of enriches the dialogue that we can have. I think that being a conservative on a campus like Yale, like Yale's, kind of really forces you to be persuasive in your discussions and really consider the exact words that you use. And it puts you on the spot and forces you to think harder. And I think that's a good thing. And so I think, it's been great, those seminars with it's been a very intellectually diverse experience in the seminars, just due to the demographics. And I think the Buckley program has been great.
What were the topics of the other seminars?
The Federalist Papers and the ethics of capitalism.
And
And the most recent one was on Tocqueville.
Yale professor or somebody you brought in?
They're external professors that we bring in. Yeah. And it was actually Charles Kessler who taught the one on the Federalist Papers. He actually published a new edition of that book, which was pretty neat.
So you mentioned that sort of political movements, Title IX, those kinds of things roll from campus to campus once a model is established somewhere. Has this society thought of perhaps putting out a playbook to start this model on other campuses? Or are there other societies like this on other campuses? Because I think, what you've told us today is incredibly valuable in terms of reinvigorating debate. Is it going on elsewhere, similar societies? Saul Alinsky had a playbook when he was trying to radicalize college students and community organizers, and it was just passed along from place to place. So,
Yeah. So Lauren probably can talk about
Yeah.
this more extensively.
Lauren, do you want to address that?
I can also talk about it a little bit. Lauren, if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't established chapters anywhere else or anything along those lines. I mean, there are other programs out there. Princeton has the James Madison program. Hamilton College has an organization called the Alexander Hamilton Institute. So, you know, there are voices of reason and open dialogue out there.
I mean, Lauren also won't. I mean, I'm on the board, so I see some of what Lauren does. Lauren does a phenomenal job at teaching other folks what she's doing. So, you know, she does go out of her way to make sure other folks know what we're doing. They know our model. They know how we do it. I mean, we're probably one of the more successful programs of our kind. So I do think that Lauren is doing a phenomenal job. On the other hand, it would be to actually go and set up chapters at other campuses is very difficult. I mean, one of the things is we're a very Yale-specific organization. We provide resources for Yale students, and we are very good at providing those resources. When you look at some of the other organizations that provide resources, you know, I think AEI has a program, and they're great, but they're external to a campus. We are internal to a campus. We understand the way the university runs. Our students are, you know, leading this and are sort of at the forefront of a lot of the programming. I think that is a very difficult thing to export. I don't even begin to know how you export it. When we had a protest around the time of the Halloween incident, I knew as a board member who would we talk to in the dean's office? What are the chains of command? I don't even begin to know on another campus what those chains of command would look like.
Yeah, there are organizational issues, but the sine qua non of replication would be a charismatic leader who is an organizer, and that's Lauren. So I think her hands are probably full with Yale.
Yeah.
You had a question?
Yes, I'm class of '62. I wanted to ask you, the president hasn't been mentioned, President Trump, how much he may have complicated your work. So I think most of us would agree, certainly National Review, that he's not a classic conservative. And he is in many areas unpopular for a lot of reasons, misogyny and other things. And his policies are unclear. So I wonder if the conservative movement on campus, and in fact the First Amendment movement on campus, has been blurred somewhat by the Trump ascendancy and makes your work harder, or is it irrelevant to what you're doing?
So I think there are two aspects of this. One of them can be pretty clearly seen in the recent debate over graduate student unionization, where one of the prime things that the graduate student union has been saying is that the Yale administration, by appealing to the NLRB, is basically Trumpist and is just throwing his lot in with Trump and is evil and bad as a result. That's the way in which all things which seem vaguely conservative get tainted by Trump. And, you know, you're basically anathema to campus at that point. But at the same time, I think that Yale is in this sort of unique spot of having gotten a lot of its political sort of aneurysm out during the fall 2015 incidents. It seems like campus politics is much more colored by the Halloween stuff than by Trump, to the extent that the battle lines were drawn then. They were already in place in fall 2016, and they really weren't changed all that much. So I think the effect of Trump on campus actually hasn't been that huge. It's maybe made professors of a certain type sort of more hysterical about things, but it hasn't fundamentally changed their outlook, and it hasn't changed all that much the way that discussion occurs on campus.
Individually, at meals in the residential dorms, how does it impact your daily conversations with other students?
I'm not quite sure how to answer that. I mean, it makes the risk of treading on the wrong eggshells when you're talking about politics a bit higher. It makes it a bit harder to defend your own viewpoint because you're defending, or it makes it harder to defend a viewpoint that is also the viewpoint of Donald Trump. But I think that's just a challenge that you have to confront. And, as far as intellectual development goes, it's probably a good one. I remember in the period after the travel ban was imposed in January, there was lots of discussions on campus about whether that was a bad thing or a good thing, and everyone agrees that it was a bad thing. But it was quite hard in that time to elucidate a sort of position that elements of it are good, but overall the thing is bad, or maybe the ban is good, but Trump is bad. It was sort of a black or white distinction. So we as conservatives have to work a bit harder in this atmosphere to sort of find the nooks and crannies of the viewpoints and sort of tease out what we really think independent of Trump.
And what about,
I think that's the best perspective to take.
what about the situation in terms of the current sensitivity about a lot of issues? Are you labeled because of your participation in the Buckley Society? Do people know that?
Not much and not more than before. I think it's probably down to the fact that the Buckley program does have a lot of liberals in it as well, who you're not going to easily label as pro-Trumpist. So maybe you can label individual members of the Buckley program as Trumpists, but not the Buckley program as a whole.
So you're saying that the campus issues are much more important than the Trump issue?
Overall, yes. I'd say that's true.
Yeah, I would totally agree and say that even in 2015, it was just as scary to have a conversation with a new person you're meeting and tell them your view on the renaming of Calhoun as it would be now, to have a conversation with someone you're meeting and tell them your view on the president. So I think you're right. The battle lines were drawn over campus issues, and they just extended to the Trump administration. And, even when a couple times on campus, it was after the weekend after the Women's March, was like, what did you do this weekend? And I was, I went on a hike actually, and they were like, you didn't go march? And it became like a crazy thing that someone wouldn't go and participate in any of the marches. And the fact that then you're kind of lumped in, it doesn't have as much to do with the Buckley program as I think it's just a Manichaean distinction of you're either with us or against us. And they throw it in with Trump, they throw it in with being in a conservative organization, and they just throw it with being on the wrong side of the campus issues that they believe in.
Yeah, I think Cameron's right to say that a lot of issues are painted as either black or white, and it's really hard to tease out nuances in your personal positions. But I do think one place about which we can be optimistic is that membership in the Buckley program isn't really a black or white type thing. In terms of, you're either good or bad for being in the Buckley program, just because I think our demographic of fellows is so diverse, politically and intellectually speaking. It's not very easy to paint a Buckley fellow as having a particular set of beliefs. And I think that is a sign that we stick true to our mission of intellectual diversity, and that when you're in conversations on campus, membership in the Buckley program doesn't necessarily mean that you believe really anything other than in free speech.
In the back?
Yeah, that statistic about 50% living off campus was pretty startling. And the question that you raised, or listening to this conversation, cause or effect, you're describing this hyper-politicized climate where you meet somebody and you say the wrong word. Do you think that's driving people off campus? Just to quote it, a safe space when they're...
It's probably a cyclical process. I mean, I can't tell you for sure, and I don't think anyone could. I don't think you could regress out the individual variables. I think it'd be very difficult. On the Trump question, if I could respond to that very briefly, one of the things I think is very important to do as well is also not to lump in all criticisms of the president. I think there are many very legitimate ones, and I'm very concerned with the fact that some of the folks on campus who have been holding sort of whatever it is post the election are kind of silly. So, just because folks have a therapy dog and coloring books after the election doesn't mean there aren't legitimate grievances and very serious worries. And I think that one of the problems, the major problem of sort of the campus protests around some of these issues is it actually delegitimizes concerns, real concerns. And so I think that, in fact, one of the things folks should be trying to do, students especially, is having as mature as possible discussions around criticisms. Again, very serious, very legitimate, very concerning criticisms, in my personal view, of the administration. And I think that gets overshadowed by, well, we brought in the therapy dog and the coloring book. And that's kind of silly.
In the white shirt you have.
My name is Alberto Maestra. I'm class of 1962. And I would like to simply say that I feel free speech at Yale has been under threat for many years, because I remember perfectly well in 1961 when I was debating the Fair Play for Cuba committee here, a lady that participated in the debate hit me over the head with an umbrella. And I also remember that many of my classmates, and Yale was not formed in the composition of students that we have today. There weren't that many Asians, not that many colored people, not that many foreign students. I was Latin America. I still have an accent, less now than I did then, but everybody thought of me as being a wealthy guy, somebody that had been in trouble in Cuba, and that Castro was pretty much somebody that was bringing Cuba to a level that should be a better middle class, a more democratic country. And I feel that that has been going on for many years within Yale, and I wonder why it is that the professors and the faculty here, and I will specifically mention that I read someplace that one of the teachers here at Yale had given the day free to the students following the elections because they felt the students were being pressured or were depressed by the result of the elections, which is something that really worried me. I'll say something else. I told some of my friends, class of 1962, that I was coming to this breakfast today, and they all raised their eyebrows. Buckley program, oh my God, you're going there. You know, those guys are super conservative. So my question to you now, after my little speech, is how do you rate President Saliva, whom I know very little, but I saw him speak in Miami when he went down there about 2 years ago. How do you rate him in terms of really promoting free speech and diversity of thinking in the university? That's my question. That's my question.
So I don't know, I don't want to occupy the panel. Two things. The first is I think that speech issues are cyclical. So I think that one of the reasons you can say this has always happened is that sort of, every decade you can expect once or twice a decade for campuses to have explosions like this. 68 to 72 it happens. Sort of after May Day-ish in 71, it starts trailing off. And then the 70s are quiet, and then you get it again in the 80s. And it's, you can just chart it out over the course of the past 60 years. So I think that it is true that it happens consistently over time. As for President Saliva, I had very high hopes, and I would rate him pretty badly. I would personally not be terribly surprised if he's not reappointed. And I think that folks on campus, what's impressive about President Saliva, he has managed to piss off absolutely everyone in the university. There is no one who's happy across any spectrum, faculty, staff, you name it. That maybe he deserves some congratulations for a very impressive feat there.
I would disagree with Nathaniel in terms of the cyclical nature of this. I think that what you've got now is something very contextual and structural. This is not like the 60s or the cyclical phenomena. I think in America, in terms of the separatist issues that we deal with in our society, make this categorically different than the 60s or the cyclical phenomena. In terms of Saliva, he's highly reactive, and that could mean, for me, it means a lack of leadership.
On the Saliva question, I think Peter Saliva's attitudes towards free speech are determined by his attitudes towards the power of the administration. And really what he wants to do is increase bureaucratic control and bureaucratic power. So on certain issues, he actually does fairly well on free speech. On grad student unionization, he's been an active proponent of having a real debate about grad student unionization and not just sort of letting Local 33 drive the whole discussion. And they do it in their particular totalitarian way. So there he's been good, but at the same time he's leading endeavors like the faculty standards of conduct, which are providing a sort of show trial way for the administration to possibly revoke tenure, certainly censure faculty members who transgress a certain code that could possibly include modes of political expression. This is all done with the intent to increase the control of the administration and to decrease sort of the autonomy of the faculty. More generally, I think, but this isn't Salve himself doing it per se. It's sort of a trend that's been occurring for probably 20 or 30 years, namely that of the agglomeration of power by the bureaucracy. Salve himself, I think, is relatively weak-kneed, reactive, more content to avoid bad press than to do something that would really advance the academic mission. Like Nate, I again wouldn't be surprised if he's not reappointed, and I've heard rumors to that effect. I think Yale has suffered under him not just in the free speech domain, but in the academic domain as well. And the name Yale has become something of a laughingstock in the national press. But to see his attitudes on free speech, I think you have to look at what he thinks of his own standing of in the power relations with the faculty. I think that's what's really driving how he treats free speech on campus.
Cameron?
Yeah, I agree 100% with Noah that, if it suits his interest, he will get behind free speech. But the problem is that he is so reactive that we haven't seen him have a leader-like presidency. We don't know what his real vision is because his whole term has been embroiled by scandals that he's just been reacting to. And you don't want to reappoint someone who hasn't had a vision for the university that's being enacted, and instead is just looking to keep his power shored up and to work on the administrative end and making sure that the administration stays strong. He has had good things. He acknowledged when Calhoun was renamed that reasonable people could disagree about the Calhoun issue. And then on the graduate student front, he's sent some very well-written emails. But the question is what his interests are in sending these emails. And then once he sees alumni get angry and maybe stop giving money, maybe you see him change his tune, but it's not because he believes that, it's because he has to. He needs to shore up the money and shore up any sort of power. He has angered everybody, as Nathan was saying, and it is very impressive to watch him because you often don't find someone who could aggrieve so many different parties on this university, but he's managed to do it very well, and I think he is starting to realize what he's done, but it could be very well too late.
We're looking for short-term signals here, and one of them are these the issues about alumni giving, and it's almost as if you're looking at a month-to-month or quarterly earnings report, which doesn't tell you much in general. And the long-term consequences of this are going to be significant. And because Yale is a juggernaut in terms of an endowment, in terms of a brand name, the real issues won't surface for a long time. And I think that one of the things that needs to be done is tracking the students. What happens to someone 6 to 8 years after they had been admitted to Yale? But this attempt to look at the consequences on a short-term basis is probably less important than seeing what's going to happen negatively on a long-term basis. Nathaniel?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's actually, to echo Gene, one of the things that's very interesting of the upheavals in, say, 68 to 72 at Yale, which I'm very interested in, is that at the time there was a lot of talk about a stop in alumni giving. And then, in fact, they did some internal research that's available in the archives that I've looked at that actually showed that it didn't really do much to the budget. Most of the money was coming from Paul Mellon and Jock Whitney. And I think that's probably pretty similar today in terms of the actual sort of finances over a couple-year basis is not going to really fluctuate.
Yeah, but because of the size of the endowment, it was less important now than it was then.
Oh, but even then, I don't think it had much of an effect anyway, because you had these, couple of very, very wealthy alumni. Where I think it did matter was a sense of sort of parliamentary majoritarianism. There's a sense that, you wanted to have alumni support because it was a constituency that matters. Why alumni matter as a constituency is a funny question. If you take out money, but there's a sense, I think, in any university that sort of an unhappy alumni is a bad thing. and we could interrogate why. But I think that especially folks who are themselves alumni are cognizant of that. Kingman Brewster certainly was.
Yeah, in terms of getting back a little bit on course in terms of the impact of the Buckley Society, again, could you describe in a little more, Cameron, you didn't have a chance to talk about this, the programs and the impact on you and also the rest of the student body, the speakers that come here wouldn't be here without the Buckley Society, and this provocation of a discussion wouldn't be here without the Buckley Society.
Yeah, I think that I didn't get a chance to take any of those spring break seminars, and I really would like to. But in terms of the general programming that we have week to week, there are many different types of events. My favorite is the firing line, because I do enjoy getting two different perspectives and hearing them debate and hearing tough questions asked. But we've had a good combination. We have these dinner seminars pretty frequently. We had Charles Cook from National Review Online, and he was fantastic. It was actually here at the Quinnipiac Club to be in an intimate setting with him, to talk about the election, to talk about his book. And it provides our fellows with a good chance, you know, if you're very interested in more healthcare policy, we had a healthcare debate. If you're interested in more, you know, economic policy, we had the minimum wage debate. So we go all across the political spectrum with different types of events, whether it's in the lecture, the dinner seminar, or in the firing line format. And that's great because it keeps the students engaged, and, you know, non-fellows are obviously allowed to attend. And I have plenty of friends who are not fellows who see the events, they see the posters, or they see an ad in the YDN, and then they show up because the speaker interests them.
The poster child for that, of course, is J.D. Vance, where 800 people showed up for his presentation.
Yeah, exactly. The J.D. Vance event filled up the Omni Ballroom. That's good for the program because people are seeing, you know, we're bringing important people to campus, people whose perspectives need to be heard, and people who are bringing interesting new ideas to Yale, and that's what the program is supposed to be doing. It's to be enhancing debate.
Yeah, quick question. Is the Board of Trustees falling down in their responsibility, normally in a private sector scenario, if the management, that is to say President Saliva, is underperforming, the board intervenes? Are they anywhere to be seen?
They actually are intervening right now. They're scheduling a sort of 5-year performance review of the president, which they claim happens on a regular basis. It does not, in fact, happen on a regular basis. The rumor is that this is going to be a pretext for firing him. We'll see if that actually happens. I think Nate probably knows more about the model of university governance than I do, but I think that the corporation has traditionally sort of appointed the president and then given him some latitude to do what he will. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, you see, look, I mean, it is no surprise that in academia, in nonprofits, you see the same captured board problem that you do in corporations. And so, you know, without actually being inside, it'd be very hard to tell what internal discussions are like. There is a sense that if you compare what the corporation was like, say, I keep coming back to Kingman Brewster's era, and the corporation now, you have a very different type of person who's on the corporation. In Kingman Brewster's era, you had people like Vance, who was, at that point, when he was on the corporation, the Assistant Secretary of Defense. He would go on to be Secretary of State. You had people like George Bundy. You had people like John Lindsay. You had folks who had spent their lives in public service and didn't need the job, and so did what they did because they wanted to serve the university and they were willing to stand for principles. My own assessment is that when you appoint someone who has spent their life, and, you know, one of the people was, I think, I don't know if she's currently on the board, the CEO of Chanel. Presumably a very intelligent person when it comes to operations and management. But I think also got something out of, you know, to be honest, out of being a member of the corporation. There was a certain sense of legitimacy that comes with it, becoming attached to the university. And I think you're less willing to rock the boat. And I think that people like John Lindsay and George Bundy on a day-to-day basis took stands and took principle.
This begs the question of something, the op-ed that Lauren wrote for the Wall Street Journal, which is, should you know more about the views of the people who become trustees? The question in the back?
Speaking of the corporation, I was surprised to see that it unanimously flip-flopped on the renaming issue. Does that say something about the members of the Board of Trustees?
Yeah, I think I think it was a rationalization to not weighing in on terms of whether the name should be changed or not, but it was a rationalization that it should be changed, and there was no real criteria. Is it because Calhoun was a slave owner? Was it because he was a white supremacist? And in the other issues that you're seeing in New Orleans and elsewhere, was it because he was part of the Confederacy? So there's no general criteria for this, and you can apply this across the board in terms of historical perspective. I think we're running a little bit out of time, and I think that one of the things that perhaps in terms of the soul of the university is a very eloquent letter that Nathaniel wrote for the YDN in terms of the unionization issue, in terms of whether you can deal with it in terms of technical knowledge about the law, or you can deal with it in terms of the soul of the university. And I think that if you want to say a few words about that.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, so I don't know how much folks are familiar. There is an attempt to unionize graduate students, and the attempt is occurring not just here, it's occurring at campuses, private school campuses around the country. And I think this is a mistake. And one of the reasons it's a mistake is it fundamentally changes the relationship between the graduate student. It reimagines that relationship between the graduate student and their own students who they're teaching and the university. And it changes it from a collegial relationship where you're part of a community that lives, learns, and creates knowledge to a community that is based around a conception of employment. And a community that's based around its conception of employment is one where your relationship ends at 5 o'clock. It's one where you have a more adversarial relationship to the institution. And so I personally think that graduate student unionization is wrong from a technical legal perspective. I think the NLRB got it wrong. But from what it does to the soul of the university, I think, is in potentially can create a university that is much more fractious.
Just a quick follow-up on that. I agree with what you said.
He needs to record
We need to give you the mic.
Sorry.
There's a mic coming somewhere.
Oh,
So I was fortunate yesterday, almost literally to
No, go ahead, sorry.
Should I cede the mic?
No, please.
So I was fortunate to run into the president of the university just walking on the street in front of SSS yesterday. And so I shook his hand and I said, "What about free speech?"
And he said?
And he was generous with his time. There were about 7 of us exiting a lecture. So he spent time and he took the floor, as it were. It was on the pavement. And he, absent any kind of historical knowledge of this, and I'm not saying I'm highly, expert on the subject, he said all the right things. He said, he's into discourse and he wants people to have civil debate and he wants to set things up where people can, go back and forth, and protest should be, allowed, but at arm's length, like across the street. You want to have your protest, you can have another event of your own, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm just wondering how, whether that rings true in the current university, because from things I've read peripherally, and I haven't followed this on an everyday basis, it didn't sound like that was the case. I mentioned Silliman as a bad look, and the video that's gone around, and he didn't really kind of touch on the whole Halloween thing, cultural appropriation, or et cetera. That just kind of passed, and he was talking about that he was in a debate with somebody, he said he was a hard libertarian, which didn't sound like the interesting, it was an interesting juxtaposition of words. He was like a really rabid libertarian he had debated with, but things went well nonetheless on a personal basis. But, so I'm just wondering whether his words ring true.
I think you've just answered your own question.
Yeah, I mean, right, two things. What matters is what he does in the breach, and I don't think he's been particularly good in the breach. And then the second thing is that we allied a lot of separate issues, and this panel probably doesn't have the time to talk about them, but we allied whether, from a technical perspective, the sort of technical, what we would call almost pseudo-First Amendment things are abided by on a university campus. Was a speaker given a room? Was the police force there to prevent any disruption, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? From a climate question, which is, are folks able to engage in the kind of things that are necessary to have an open, free exchange of ideas, which is civility. And I think that as a president, you have to, A, do the technical thing, which is to say, technically, here are the resources that are available to you and the rights, and then here's a climate of civility that goes along with those rights.
I think perhaps to end this, because you've got other programs to go to, what I'd like to know from the students would be, what do you think personally the Buckley program has impacted you in terms of your experience at Yale?
I think that my experience at Yale would definitely be very different without the Buckley program. Yeah, I think the Buckley program has been a great outlet for the sorts of intellectual discussions that I wouldn't necessarily otherwise be able to have, an outlet for friendships with like-minded people, an outlet for job opportunities. The internships that I've done have been with the Buckley program coordinated internships with the New Criterion and with the Manhattan Institute. Even my vacation time has been filled with Buckley program activities with the fall and spring break seminars. So yeah, I think the Buckley program is very worthwhile, and I've really enjoyed my involvement with it.
It's exposed me to a whole litany of new ideas and sort of has vastly enriched my extracurricular life, without which it wouldn't be sort of this intellectual milieu. So I think that's fantastic to have at Yale.
Yeah, echoing both the sentiments of Noah and Maddie, I'm so grateful for the Buckley program, and I'm only halfway done with Yale, so I can imagine the second half. The Buckley program will also play a huge role in both my intellectual environment, but also, as Maddie mentioned, the friendships, the social events that we have, and being able to meet these kids who share common interests and who are willing to participate in debate and discussion. The Buckley program has created this community within Yale, and I'm very grateful for it, and I'm looking forward to another 2 years of great speakers, great friends, great events, and meeting incredible people.
So on that, we'll end, and also another round of applause for Lauren.